we have both Republican strategist Ford O'Connell from Washington, and via telephone, the Boston Herald columnist and talk show host Howie Carr. So let's go first to Ford O'Connell. Ford, perhaps it's a generational difference. When I think of literary allusions and the Magnolia State, I think of William Faulkner. But you were talking more about John Gresham and the John Gresham novels, offering insight into what happens in Mississippi elections. The twists and turns, Ford O'Connell, of this Mississippi Republican runoff. Give us your quick take on the results last night and the possible aftermath.
Well, Thad Cochran was effectively left for dead after the primary. And it really seemed that Chris McDaniel had the momentum, and Thad, in a very narrow window of time, about 3 weeks, really had to go back and do a couple things. He had to call on every political marker he could that anyone ever owed him, from Brett Favre to donors, etc. He had to fine-tune his message, and instead of pandering to the base, he decided to tack to the middle and basically tout incumbency and the fact that he'd bring home the pork. And then finally, this was the amazing thing from a get-out-the-vote perspective. He decided to increase the voter universe. And he did this essentially by an archaic rule that allows Democrats who did not vote in the Democratic primary to be able to vote in the runoff primary, even on the GOP side. So, hats off to him. I have to say this was an amazing thing. But as the Tea Party hacked off, you bet, JD. And frankly, the GOP is going to have to find a way to basically mend this fence between now and Election Day in Mississippi.
Well, you have laid out what happened, and we're talking now about Chris McDaniel, who has yet to concede. Last night, he showed up to talk to his supporters. Take a listen to what State Senator Chris McDaniel had to say.
A strong and sturdy people we are, a brave people we are, a people that still can lead the conservative revival in this country, and we will lead the resurgence. That begins right here in Mississippi.
So there he is talking about that, and what do you expect? Has he gotten a phone call from Thad Cochran or vice versa? How do they mend fences down there, Ford?
Well, unfortunately, the battle between the Republican parties, Hatfields and McCoys, if you will, really took center stage in Mississippi. But at the end of the day, this is going to have to be a way where they say, look, Chris, there's got to be a way that your political career isn't over and we can help you. But if we can't deliver this seat up in Washington for the Republicans in Mississippi, we're going to have major problems. And I know, Chris, at the end of the day, your love is for the state of Mississippi and not for the Democratic Party. I understand you think that this was underhanded, but politics is not a gentleman's game, and the rules were the rules, Chris. That's really how he's going to have to handle it. But he's going to have to use that little genteel Southern heel, if you will, JD, in terms of really smoothing it over with Chris and his supporters, because they are livid right now.
Well, you mentioned that, and there are a couple of supporters of Chris McDaniel who reflect the mood down in Mississippi. Again, let's go to the sound clips we have from election night last night.
His speech was just such a gracious and humble speech, yet it wasn't one of concession. So we don't feel like that he is conceding this race, and we stand behind him 100%.
I think that this fight is not over here. Now, I'm not necessarily referring to the Senate race. I'm not sure what he will do in the days ahead regarding that, but I know Chris, and I know that he'll continue to stand and fight for conservative principles that he believes to be right.
Well, let's call in Howie Carr on this because, Howie, although you're up in Boston, you went to school down south at the University of North Carolina. I won't hold that against you as an NC State alum. But this whole situation now, Howie, because, Ford talks about Thad getting done what he had to get done, but to win that primary, he had to bring in Democrats to basically carry him across the finish line. And boy, it sticks in the craw of grassroots conservatives.
Right, JD. You mentioned William Faulkner. One of his famous quotes is, "The past isn't dead; it really isn't even past." And I listened to those robocalls that they were making earlier this week to the black Democrats in Mississippi, And it sounded like going back to the days of the freedom delegations to the Democratic conventions. Send Thad Cochran back to Washington to help Obama. I mean, I just assumed that was going to backfire on Thad Cochran, but I guess in a narrow race where he only won by about 4,000 votes, he was able to pull it out. I mean, that's really it really does stick in the craw though of the majority of Republicans in Mississippi, and I'm just wondering if maybe they can go back and find a few Democrats in Jackson, Mississippi, in that county. What is it, Hines County? That voted in the Democratic primary and then picked up a ballot yesterday. That seems to be what they're basing their slim hopes on.
Yeah, and so they haven't contested because they are going to make a check of ballots. Ford O'Connell, let me posit one possible solution to this. Having been through this in the past, and quite frankly, having had salt poured in the wounds with some passions running high, what about the notion of a third party coming in? For example, seems to me Thad has to make a conservative case for appropriations. In other words, look, the constitutional power is in the hands of the legislative branch, not some bureaucrat. And if you have a vacuum, the Obama crowd is going to come in and run that to try to find a philosophical path back to conservatives. And to do so, maybe he needs to call on Senator Rand Paul to pay a visit to Mississippi and explain that constitutional theory of the reasonable, rational philosophy of appropriations being the domain of the legislative branch. Is that too arcane a strategy?
I really don't think it's going to work, JD. And unfortunately, the problem is if you go third party or you sit at home, the Democrats are going to win it. And you have to understand how racially divided Mississippi is. 37% of the state is black and 60% of the state is white. And right now, if you really sit at home, you're going to wind up having Travis Childers win. And at the end of the day, the state is going to lose. I know this goes tantamount to conservative thinking, but you have to understand that Mississippi, for every dollar they give the federal government, they take it back in $3. And I cannot stand it when Republicans want to ride the big government bus. But I'm going to be honest with you, JD, that's pretty much how Thad Cochran won. Hopefully Chris McDaniel, who had the right ideas, was not the greatest candidate and had a weak campaign staff, will hold Thad's feet to the fire, because at the end of the day, what is killing the great state of Mississippi is hurting America across the board, my friend.
Well, we will leave Mississippi and go to Massachusetts north. I know my friends in New Hampshire don't want to hear that, but Howie, that's what's happening in Massachusetts. You have a situation now where Scott Brown, the former Massachusetts senator, going north to New Hampshire. And Howie, your latest column says that suddenly, well, these are my words, but it's the only analogy I can think of, suddenly Mitt Romney comes back in, and it's Mitt Romney and Scott Brown in a political Republican duo reminiscent of Batman and Robin. Give us the lowdown on that.
Right. Well, the irony here, JB, is that when Scott Brown was running for a full term in the Senate 2 years ago against Elizabeth Warren, he was giving a really wide berth to Mitt Romney, even though they were political allies at the State House in Massachusetts, because he didn't want to nationalize the election. He knew Mitt was going to lose Massachusetts, and he didn't want to be too tightly tied to him. So he lost anyway. Mitt lost, and then Mitt has been spending a lot of time on the campaign trail for other candidates. There's sort of a buyer's remorse among Republicans that they didn't treat him more charitably. And now in New Hampshire, where Scott Brown is trying to unseat Jeanne Shaheen, Mitt Romney, according to all the polls, would be the most popular candidate for president in 2016. He's more popular than he was the first two times he ran in 2008 and 2012. So as Mitt has ascended in New Hampshire, his fellow, you pardon the expression, carpetbagger from Massachusetts, Scott Brown, is having all kinds of problems. He just can't seem to stop tripping over himself. Jean Shaheen, who's the incumbent senator, she's going for her second term. She's proving to be a much more nimble campaigner than I think Scott Brown expected. She was governor 3 times, 2-year terms, so they were, she was always running. She's been able to shovel some dirt on Scott Brown with some penny stock companies that he was involved in, and she's first on the airwaves, taking a measure.
Yeah, she's got to define him, and we understand that, and also it's comparatively crowded New Hampshire Republican primary. Former Senator Bob Smith back in the race there. Before the break, about a minute left. Ford O'Connell, want to get your national perception of this. Mitt Romney now loading up to help Scott Brown in New Hampshire. Does this rekindle in Mitt Romney a desire to run for the presidency next time around?
He says no, but he certainly wants to do it, because the question here is going to be how much does the current GOP names out there falter, your Christies, your Cruzes, etc. If there is daylight out there, Mitt Romney is going to look for it, but at the end of the day, I still don't think he's going to run. But Howie makes a great point. As a big fan of the Boston Herald and Howie's, and having done work both in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, this is a relationship of political convenience, and Scott Brown had to run in the 2012 elections because Mitt Romney got pillaged in the GOP version of the Hunger Games 2012 primary, and that's what really hurt. Now they're having their political alliance again.
Gentlemen, an invigorating discussion, a discussion that will continue on other subjects on the other side of this break. Meantime, we want you to weigh in. Why don't you tweet us your comments at NewsMax TV, #America's Forum.